In 1973, a housewife in Coventry could silence an entire dining room with nothing but a wobbling dome of chocolate blancmange and a tin of Mandarin oranges. Before tiramisu arrived from Italy and cheesecake conquered every restaurant menu, British home cooks were conjuring desserts that shook on the plate, turned out of copper molds, and defied all logic. Some looked like hedgehogs. Some tasted of prunes. Some were held together with nothing but condensed milk and ambition. 20 of these puddings have vanished so completely that most people under 40 have never tasted them. And here is what nobody tells you. Some of them were genuinely extraordinary. Hit subscribe before we begin, because what you are about to discover might make you unexpectedly nostalgic for a decade you thought you had forgotten. Number 20. Hedgehog pudding. Before Black Forest gateau conquered the 1970s dinner party circuit, there was the hedgehog. Women's magazines, from Good Housekeeping to Woman's Own, carried versions of this recipe throughout the early part of the decade, and on Friday evenings in kitchens from Cardiff to Carlisle, the smell of melting chocolate and crushed digestives drifted through terraced houses. The base was simple: broken biscuits, butter, cocoa powder, and a tin of condensed milk pressed into a domed mound on a flat plate and chilled overnight. The genius came at the last moment. Before serving, you pushed blanched almond slivers into the surface at rakish angles, creating a coat of edible quills that caught the kitchen light. 2 glace cherries became eyes. A nub of white chocolate formed a snout. The result sat trembling on the table like something escaped from a Beatrix Potter illustration, drawing gasps from children who had never seen food shaped like an animal. A tin of condensed milk cost 18 pence in 1974. The whole pudding cost under £1 and fed 8 people. When mousse and gateau crowded it off the menu in the late 1970s, the hedgehog vanished without ceremony. Nobody brought it back. Number 19. Lemon flummery. The word alone sounds like something from a Victorian nursery tale, and in British kitchens of the 1970s, lemon flummery occupied exactly that strange borderland between the old and the modern. Housewives dissolved a sachet of gelatine in hot water, whisked in condensed milk, lemon juice, and finely grated zest, then poured the pale yellow liquid into glass dishes and refrigerated it until it set into a dense, wobbly cream. The texture was unlike anything sold in shops, somewhere between a mousse and a jelly, richer than either, with a sharp citrus bite that cut cleanly through the sweetness. A Women's Institute recipe leaflet from 1971 described it as elegant fare for a summer Sunday. Lemons cost about 4 pence each. A sachet of Davis gelatine ran to 7 pence. For under 30 pence you had a pudding that looked like it belonged in a hotel dining room. Oral histories from the era recall the small glass dishes set out on the sideboard an hour before guests arrived, pale surfaces dusted with fine zest, looking impossibly refined. When Angel Delight arrived in its bright foil packet, promising the same effect in 3 minutes and at lower cost, Lemon flummery quietly conceded defeat. It disappeared from cookbooks by 1983 and has barely been mentioned since. Junket is the pudding that most reliably provokes a shudder from anyone who encountered it at a school dinner in the early 1970s. Rennet tablets, available from any chemist for 6 pence a box, were dissolved in warm, sweetened milk, poured into shallow dishes, and left to set at room temperature. The result was a quivering, barely there milk gel with the consistency of very soft tofu and the flavor of not very much. Recipes advised dusting the surface with grated nutmeg and serving chilled. Local authority school dinner registers from the period record Junket as a fixture from September through December. Children remember staring at the pale, trembling surface and willing it to resemble something recognizable. In some homes, mothers added almond essence or a spoonful of jam. In others it arrived plain and was eaten in silence. The appeal was rooted in post-war thrift. Rennet-set milk required no cooking, no sugar beyond a spoonful, and almost no effort. A pudding from a penny tablet. When convenience desserts and commercial yogurts flooded the market in the mid-1970s, Junket's virtue of cheapness was no longer virtue enough. Supermarkets stopped stocking rennet tablets in the 1980s. Most people alive today have never tasted it and would almost certainly prefer to keep things that way. Number 17. Charlotte Russe. At number 17, we encounter what might be the most elegant pudding ever produced in a 1970s British kitchen. Charlotte Russe was the party piece of confident home cooks. A tin or glass mold was lined with sponge fingers, the cavity filled with a set Bavarian cream mixture of whipped cream, custard, and gelatine, then refrigerated for 4 hours and turned out with ceremony onto a serving plate. The sponge fingers formed a neat, pale wall around a trembling ivory tower. Raspberries or tinned peaches arranged on top completed the picture. A packet of sponge fingers cost 14 pence in 1975. The cream and gelatine added perhaps another 20 pence. For under 40 pence, you had something that looked genuinely professional. Women who made Charlotte Russe regularly were spoken of with particular admiration in the neighborhood. "She does a Charlotte Russe," neighbors would say, in a tone that settled the matter of social standing entirely. Oral histories from the decade recall the suspended breath of the turnout. The mold lifted slowly, the pudding revealed intact and gleaming. When commercial gateau and cheesecakes made the effort seem disproportionate, Charlotte Russe retreated from British kitchens. By 1985, it had all but vanished. Its name is barely recognized today. Number 16. Chocolate blancmange. Not the thin, translucent fruit jelly that modern people mean when they say jelly, but something altogether more imposing. Blancmange. In the 1970s was a serious affair. Housewives dissolved corn flour and cocoa in cold milk, heated the mixture with sugar until it thickened, then poured it into ornate copper or tin molds greased with almond oil. Left overnight to set, it emerged dense and glossy, firm enough to hold the precise shape of a castle turret, or a rabbit, or a fluted ring. On Sunday afternoons, it would be turned out onto a plate and carried to the table with a jug of cream. The wobble as it settled was half the spectacle. Corn flour cost about 8 pence a packet in 1971. A mold bought from Woolworths for under a shilling lasted a lifetime. For pennies, you had a centerpiece that commanded the table. The problem was texture. By the mid-1970s, a generation raised on ice cream and instant whip found the density of blancmange off-putting. Children pushed it around the plate. Mothers persisted for a season or two. But by the time the 1980s arrived, the copper molds were gathering dust, and blancmange had slipped quietly into retirement, mourned only by the women who had made it best. Cabinet pudding is one of those dishes that British cookbooks felt obliged to include right up until the early 1980s, even as it disappeared from actual kitchens. Named for an earlier era entirely, and made by a method that had barely changed since Victorian times, it required patience that the decade was rapidly losing. A pudding basin was buttered and lined with stale sponge cake, glaced cherries and raisins, then filled with a poured custard of eggs, milk, sugar, and vanilla. It was steamed for an hour and a half in a pan of simmering water, turned out onto a plate, and served warm with thin pouring custard or jam sauce. The inside was dense and soft, somewhere between bread pudding and baked custard, faintly sweet and deeply old-fashioned even in 1972. Women's Institute cookbooks from the early part of the decade still carried the recipe as a matter of tradition. But tradition without appetite is just nostalgia. By 1976, few housewives were making cabinet pudding for anything other than sentiment. When microwave ovens arrived in British kitchens in the late 1970s, the hour-and-a-half steaming time ceased to be a test of devotion and became simply absurd. Cabinet pudding retired without a eulogy. Here is where the controversy begins. If you attended a British state school between 1965 and 1985, you have an opinion about semolina pudding. You cannot be neutral. Semolina was produced by every local authority catering department in the country by a method so standardized it might as well have been issued by the Ministry of Education. Coarse semolina grains were simmered in full-fat milk with sugar until they swelled into a pale, granular porridge. It was poured into aluminium trays and delivered to the table in portions, each with a red jam crater at the center. The combination of textures provoked strong reactions among children. Adults who made semolina at home made it differently. Less milk, more cooking time, a knob of butter stirred in at the end, fresh nutmeg grated on top. Made this way, it was something else entirely. Creamy, yielding, almost nutty. A pudding that asked nothing of you except a willing spoon. The institutional version that entire generations recoil from was a corruption, not the real thing. Semolina disappeared from home kitchens because children associated the word with school, and parents stopped fighting that association. It has not recovered, and perhaps it deserves better than the reputation it was given. Number 13. Tapioca pudding. If semolina divided opinion, tapioca united it in a single direction. Children called it frog spawn. The name stuck because it was accurate. Small white pearls of tapioca starch simmered in sweetened milk until they became translucent bubbles suspended in pale liquid, looked precisely like the egg clusters found in any British pond in March. School dinner ladies served it from the same aluminium trays with the same jam crater. The reaction was considerably more extreme. By 1972, a survey conducted by the National Schools Catering Advisory Committee found tapioca to be the single most unpopular pudding in British state schools, cited unfavorably by more than 6 in 10 primary pupils. Yet made properly in a home kitchen, with full-fat Jersey milk stirred slowly and finished with a little cream and brown sugar, tapioca was genuinely excellent, silky, clean, and deeply comforting. Oral histories from older women in the West Country recall making it on Sunday afternoons, the kitchen smelling of warm milk and vanilla, children waiting with a patience they never showed at school. The school dinner version drove tapioca from British kitchens by the end of the 1970s. Most major supermarkets no longer stock the ingredient. The frog spawn comparison turned out to be fatal. Before no-bake cheesecakes took over every recipe supplement, there was the chocolate refrigerator cake, made in every British kitchen worth its salt between about 1965 and 1980. You melted Bourneville chocolate with a large knob of butter, stirred in a tin of condensed milk, then folded in crushed digestive biscuits and a handful of dried fruit. The mixture was pressed into a greaseproof lined loaf tin and refrigerated overnight until it set hard. Sliced cold, it cut like fudge and tasted like Christmas. Some women added glaced cherries, others threw in walnuts or a spoonful of camp coffee for depth. Variations were passed between neighbors like secrets, each household claiming its version superior. The ingredients cost under 50 pence in 1973, and the result fed 12. Oral histories from the decade recall refrigerator cake appearing at every street party, school fete, and church sale, wrapped in greaseproof and cut into thick slabs. It was the pudding equivalent of a reliable friend. When commercially produced tray bakes appeared on supermarket shelves in the mid-1980s, at prices that made homemade seem poor value on time, the refrigerator cake retreated to handwritten index cards. Most of those cards are in drawers nobody opens anymore. Number 11. Apple snow. Apple snow sounds like something from a fairy tale, and in a 1970s kitchen, it had something of that quality about it. Cooking apples were peeled, stewed with sugar until soft, then pressed through a sieve to make a smooth, pale puree. Once cool, that puree was folded carefully into stiffly beaten egg whites until the mixture turned light and billowing, almost weightless. Served in glass dishes, it looked nothing like any other British pudding. The apple flavor came through clean and tart, cut through by the sweetness of the meringue foam. By the early 1970s, Bramley apples from allotment trees were arriving in British kitchens by the sackload each autumn, and apple snow was one of the principal ways of disposing of them elegantly. A dozen cooking apples cost perhaps 20 pence at a street market in 1975. The egg whites were free if you kept hens, as many households still did. This was a luxury pudding built from almost nothing. Yet apple snow was fragile. It had to be served immediately before the foam separated into a puddle of pale liquid and sad meringue. That demand for immediacy made it unsuitable for a decade, seduced by puddings you could make the day before. By 1982, it had all but disappeared. Number 10. Pineapple upside-down pudding. Not the baked cake version that occasionally still appears at village fetes, but the steamed pudding that was its predecessor and its more serious relation. Housewives lined the base of a buttered pudding basin with tinned pineapple rings, placed a glaced cherry at the center of each ring, poured over a Victoria sponge batter, covered the basin with foil, and steamed the whole thing for 90 minutes. Turned out, the pineapple emerged caramelized and sticky against the golden sponge, the cherries set like jewels in amber. Tinned pineapple was the height of post-war glamour in British kitchens. Del Monte had convinced an entire generation that pineapple meant sophistication. A tin cost 15 pence in 1972. The result turned out trembling and golden onto a white plate, suggested a kitchen of more skill than it actually possessed. The steamed version required commitment. You had to watch the water level, keep the boil steady, and resist opening the foil early. When Birdseye introduced a frozen version in the late 1970s that delivered the same flavors in 30 minutes, the 90-minute devotion started to seem unreasonable. The steamed version retreated. The baked version survived in a diluted form. The original has not been seen since. Number 9. Coconut pyramids. Here is where the food industry's betrayal of the British pudding tradition becomes most visible. Coconut pyramids appeared at every school fete, at every Women's Institute tea, and on every village hall pudding table through the early 1970s. Made from desiccated coconut bound with condensed milk, sometimes tinted pink with a drop of food coloring, they were pressed into conical shapes and baked for 15 minutes until just golden. Crisp on the outside, chewy at the center, intensely sweet. Natural white and pale pink, always arranged in alternating rows. The pairing was as recognizable as red and white roses. In 1973, a survey conducted for the British Baking Industries Research Association found coconut pyramids in over 40% of home bakers' regular repertoire, ahead of shortbread, Victoria sponge, and rock cakes. Then manufacturers began producing pre-made coconut pyramids in cellophane bags, and the quality collapsed. The commercial version used artificial flavoring and vegetable fat. People bought them once, noted they tasted nothing like their mothers had made, and stopped. Without the commercial version to maintain visibility, and without home bakers willing to compete with a packaged product on cost, the coconut pyramid faded from both shops and kitchens. A better pudding was killed by a worse imitation of itself. Rhubarb charlotte sits in the peculiar category of British puddings that were genuinely excellent but suffered from an image problem so severe that no amount of quality could save them. Breadcrumbs fried in butter until golden were layered with stewed rhubarb in a deep dish, alternating crumb and fruit, then baked at 180 degrees until the surface crisped to deep amber. The result was the structural opposite of crumble. Where crumble worked downwards from a soft topping, Charlotte worked from the base up, the bread layers absorbing rhubarb juice and fusing into something yielding below, while the top stayed crunchy above. The flavor was extraordinary. The bitterness of forced rhubarb against the richness of buttered breadcrumbs was sharpened by a jug of cold bird's custard poured over at the table. Rhubarb was free, growing in the corner of virtually every garden and allotment in Britain. Stale bread cost nothing. This pudding existed at the intersection of absolute thrift and genuine skill. But stale bread was the problem. As pre-packaged sliced loaves replaced household leftovers through the 1970s, the raw material for Charlotte dried up. Fresh bread made soggy layers. With that single change in shopping habit, rhubarb Charlotte faded, without anyone noticing it was gone. Number 7. Prune whip. The name alone explains why this pudding disappeared. In an era of increasingly sophisticated food marketing, Prune whip refused to modernize. It was called exactly what it was. Prunes cooked until soft, pressed through a sieve to make a smooth, dark puree, sharpened with lemon juice, then folded into whipped cream and set in individual glasses. The flavor was extraordinary. Rich, slightly smoky, intensely sweet, with a dark fruit depth that no other dessert in the British repertoire could match. Served with an almond biscuit or a sponge finger, it was a genuinely sophisticated pudding that a French restaurateur might have put on a menu without embarrassment. By 1960, British consumption of prunes had been falling steadily for a decade, driven by a single cultural association so powerful it had become a national joke. By 1975, supermarkets were stocking prunes in increasingly small bags, in increasingly obscure corners of the dried fruit aisle. Home cooks who remembered prune whip fondly found the ingredient hard to source, and the audience harder still to convince. The whip vanished from cookbooks by 1980, a casualty not of flavor, but of reputation. Everything tasted like a prune joke in the end, and the pudding never escaped that association, no matter how good it actually was. The Mandarin orange gateau was the pudding that defined a specific stratum of British aspiration in the 1970s. Assembled in half an hour from a fatless sponge, a tin of Mandarin oranges in syrup, and a pint of dream topping. Whipped stiff, it appeared at every dinner party in every newly carpeted front room across suburban Britain between 1971 and 1979. The sponge was split, soaked in Mandarin syrup, layered with dream topping and orange segments, reassembled, and coated entirely with more cream, the remaining fruit arranged decoratively on top. A fatless sponge mix cost 12 pence. The Mandarin tin cost 14 pence. Dream topping cost 9 pence. A gateau for 35 pence that looked like it had come from a continental patisserie. Oral histories from the decade recall the Mandarin gateau on the sideboard through dinner party season. The table extended and set with the good crockery, the gateau arriving to quiet, approving murmurs. When real double cream became affordable for ordinary households in the late 1970s, and Dream Topping's synthetic quality became suddenly impossible to ignore, the Mandarin gateau began to seem dated. Black Forest gateau, also assembled from Dream Topping, but somehow surviving the decade's changing tastes, took its place. The Mandarin version was never seen again. Number 5. Butterscotch concrete. This is the butterscotch pudding that demands an apology from someone in government. School dinner kitchens produced a butterscotch slab of such extreme density it required structural engineering to portion. Not sauce, not sponge. A solid amber rectangle served cold with a thin trickle of custard, forks bent at unusual angles. Yet made properly at home, with good butter, dark muscovado, and just enough cream to prevent oversetting, it was sensational. The school version was overcooked, overset, and underfunded. It destroyed the reputation of something that deserved considerably better, and an entire generation of potential admirers was lost before anyone thought to defend it. Egg whites poached in sweetened milk, floated on vanilla custard, finished with a thread of caramel. The result looked like nothing else produced in a British kitchen. Theatrical, continental, achievable by any careful cook in under an hour. Women who mastered it were spoken of with reverence at bridge tables. When Nouvelle Cuisine exhausted its welcome in the early 1980s, and British food reasserted its honest unfussiness, floating islands sank without ceremony and have barely surfaced since. Tipsy cake was a fatless sponge, pierced all over and drenched in medium sherry, blanketed in whipped cream and studded with blanched almonds. It was served in thick slices that released a faint amber perfume of sherry before you even tasted it. In homes where the decanter sat on the sideboard year-round, tipsy cake announced a certain kind of household. When wine replaced sherry as the educated British drink in the early 1980s, tipsy cake lost its cultural footing in a single season. It has not recovered. Number 2. Mock cream trifle. Not the trifle you know. Dream topping, a sachet of white powder whisked with cold milk, piped through a forcing bag into careful rosettes over bird's custard and jelly-soaked sponges. A glace cherry placed with particular precision at the summit. For a generation when real cream was a luxury, this was Sunday's finest. When cream became affordable and dream topping's artificiality became impossible to ignore, the mock cream trifle was quietly retired. Nothing on the table had come close. Number 1. The pineapple and cream cheese jelly ring. Cream cheese beaten into setting lemon jelly, tinned pineapple folded through, poured into a ring mold and refrigerated overnight. Turned out onto lettuce leaves and served with sponge fingers. It appeared on the front cover of the Women's Institute recipe booklet in 1974 and was made with absolute sincerity in households across Britain for a full decade. Then the 1980s arrived, and everything that had seemed glamorous suddenly seemed embarrassing. It disappeared in a single season. Nobody defended it. Nobody mourned it. It simply stopped being made one winter and was never made again. These 20 puddings demanded your presence. They asked you to watch, to stir, to wait, to care. That devotion went unrewarded when commercial alternatives promised the same in a fraction of the time. Share in the comments which one you remember, and if anyone's Nan still makes the Hedgehog, I genuinely need to know where she lives.